Well, the theme of the Raisina Dialogues 2018 has been about managing disruptive transitions. Many of these disruptive transitions are in the form of conflicts that are taking place in many parts of the world, particularly the Middle East. Joining us to talk about some of that and reconstruction work in a post-conflict scenario is Mohamed El Dashan, who runs Oxcon Consulting. You're from Egypt, Mohamed. You talk about work that you're doing, which is post-war reconstruction consulting in countries that have been going through conflict and humanitarian crises as a result of those conflicts. Tell us a little bit about which countries you're working in, what kind of work is really the most required at this moment when it comes to post-war reconstruction.
Sure. Countries that emerge from conflict have about a 50% chance of falling into conflict again. And the reason why that happens is that afterwards they don't set up the right policies that are inclusive, that generate economic growth for everybody, that take care of minorities, that actually build better relations with neighboring countries and so on. So there's an increased emphasis, precisely if we're talking about disruption, you want to try to minimize that disruption, and you want to do this by setting up better economic policies from the get-go. So the work that we try to do sometimes starts before the end of conflict, and the idea is that in a country, say, like Iraq, hopefully like Syria, you already have people working on plans for the aftermath of Syria. You want to make sure that afterwards you build the key economic sectors of the economy, you make sure that, say, things like minorities, like refugees are included, and so on. So a lot of my work is in the Middle East, so Syria and Iraq being the key ones, I guess, in the Middle East region. A lot of my work is also in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And so this is the disruption we're trying to minimize.
So your own country, Egypt, has been through its own disruptions for the last 7 or 8 years now. We've seen Mubarak overthrown, we've seen a new regime come in, we've seen President Sisi now in power for the last 4 years. What's going on in Egypt as far as the transition has been from the Mubarak era to present times? Is there a more effective democracy in place? Is there a more effective economic policy in place which is leading to wealth and progress?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. It's like, it's not simple, but the sort of the summary of it is that things are essentially worse than what they were before 2011 when Mubarak was overthrown. So you had various periods of sort of non-government, let's say, or military rule, followed by a terrible but elected president for a year who was removed by coup by the current leader. And the current leader is actually staging elections in a couple of months. So that's going to be interesting. I wonder who's going to win. But in terms of economic achievement, it's interesting because on one hand you have a government that is spending massively on things like military equipment that you don't need, basically essentially trying to buy friends overseas. And that is putting a lot of pressure on the Egyptian economy. It's increasing the deficit. And it's quite unfortunate that they're doing this because at the same time, sort of the civilian part of the government is working really hard to redress the economy, which has been in a terrible shape. Like Egypt depends a lot on tourism and on Suez Canal revenues, the two main sources of foreign income. So since the revolution, tourists have been largely scared to come. So you have quite a lot of decrease in this. And also, sort of global trade has sort of been stagnant, not to say declining, but stagnant or like growing at below than 1%. So the main sources of revenues are not sort of functioning. So there's a lot of good reforms that are being done. They're painful reforms, and that means that there's a lot of inflation. That prices have increased. Prices have more than doubled over the last year, and that means that for the poorer classes, this is a very difficult time. So you have a government that's doing the difficult reforms that should be beneficial in the future down the line. At the same time, there's quite a lot of mismanagement that comes from the fact that they're not including other parties in government and not listening to outside opinions. So it's quite unfortunate that we're not growing.
So one of the reasons for the revolution was also the fact that there had been this rule of the elite in Egypt for decades, and the revolution was a way to ensure that there was a democratization that took place, that people came up from the bottom as well. You're talking about a situation where that hasn't really changed on the ground. For the ones who have suffered from poor economic conditions, the situation hasn't improved. taking that perhaps into the social context as well, we saw around the time of 2011, 2012, after the revolution, concerns raised everywhere about the popularity of the Muslim Brotherhood, the fact that there was an Islamist influence now in power, which wasn't the case when President Mubarak was there, for example. All these factors which have been of increasing concern to the West, are they still as much of a threat? What is the role of the Brotherhood, I guess, in politics there?
No, that's a very good question. You're absolutely right. So one of the main slogans of the revolution in 2011 was bread, freedom, and social justice. And it's quite unfortunate that on the three key fronts, you have either no development or going backwards. So in terms of political freedoms, freedom of expression, right to protest, you actually have a worsening of the situation. You have tens of thousands of new political prisoners. Egypt has been building prisons and no universities. This is what the case has been in the last few years. The Brotherhood in particular is an interesting political beast. They always had sort of an underground influence through, let's say, networks of social support. So they had free clinics, that sort of things in poor villages, and that was a big part of their
appeal.
Core,
yeah,
exactly, and why people supported them. So when they had elections. When we had elections, the first elected president came in mid 2012. They won the elections. Now, mind you, they won with, by the first round, their guy got 25% or so. So
right.
That's not to say that they're not immensely popular, but they're not negligible. At the same time, they have proven to be as politically corrupt as everybody else, and they try to, exactly what you were talking about, that elite capture, that mesh of economic and political interests, and business people making sure that laws that are done are favoring them. When they came to power for the brief period of time, they tried to replicate the exact same model, except with their guys, right? So they're not better. But if you want to talk about one thing that I'm concerned about is sort of the increase of conservatism. A lot of people who sort of were against the Muslims. I was against the Muslim Brotherhood because of their terrible governance, right? Because they were non-participatory, because they sort of try to capture state and resources and so on. That was my main deal with them, which was sort of, I guess, the core democratic one.
Right.
A lot of people, and that's completely understandable, were concerned about the growing influence of religion on civil affairs, which is also a big concern. The unfortunate part is that governments before the Brotherhood and after, perhaps even more after than before, have proven to sort of not be particularly progressive or liberal in their social policies. So you still have, Egypt is a country that has very little tolerance of dissent. The culture of people being slightly different, even just a little bit outside of the norm. And by the norm, I mean, it's like male, Muslim, of a certain social class. If you're not this, you are not welcome. And it's a terrible thing. Very recently we had, just to give an example, during a concert of a Lebanese rock band in Egypt, a bunch of people raised rainbow flags, right? It was a concert, people just waving a flag. That became sort of a massive societal issue, and these kids are in jail for waving a flag. And this is under the current government, not even the previous guys. So it's quite unfortunate that if we're talking about sort of a more open, liberal, accepting society, we're very far from that. It's quite unfortunate.
So tell me something, that's what's going on internally. Now, you talked about conflict and post-war conflict, the revolution, what we saw across the Middle East, and the successive conflicts we're seeing taking place, Iraq, Syria, all in your neighborhood, in Egypt's neighborhood. How does your work involve these countries? That's one part of the question. And the second is, how is Egypt going to protect itself from what's going on in the neighborhood? Because if there is this anger on the street, what is to prevent it from crossing over into more violence, into a small-scale war, internal civil war, for example, or the increasing presence of terror groups?
That's a very complex question and a very good one. We've been actually battling terror groups and a lot of within the country, near the border areas, east and west, so northeast and west towards Libya. And you're absolutely right. Even if you're not directly involved in conflict, things like a lot of weapons, for instance, have been coming through the border from the west, from Libya, which has had its own civil war. And that means that if you're a regional actor, you can either try to shut yourself off, but we know that's not going to happen because, people always find a way, violence always finds a way somehow, and spillovers are easy. Or you can try to sort of have a stronger footprint in your region, try to sort of project your power, try to stabilize neighboring countries, even if that comes at a cost for you, right? So if you look at what's happening in countries, for instance, that host refugees versus those that refuse to host refugees, right? The basic, aside from, say, the humanitarian impact of this, there's a basic political concern as well, is are you going to try to shut yourself but fail? Or are you going to try to sort of, that you haven't chosen the conflict, but it is happening in your backyard, and you have to try to be an influential actor. For both balancing of these concerns, of the humanitarian concern, but also of the political security, realpolitik, if you will, concern, I'm not sure that a lot of countries around the region, including my own, are not necessarily following the right path. And they're trying to respond purely militarily to a question that is far more political, far more human than it is purely military.
Right.
But a lot of countries I think see that. Now, thankfully, I really hope that we sort of try to take lessons from India, that is increasingly sort of projecting its soft power in the region. This is something that we've been failing to do. But this is a lesson I hope we take.
What do you think the path is for Egypt to do that? I mean, whether it's in the case of the conflicts around you, whether it's in the case of, the historic Arab-Israeli conflict that's taking place in the region, how do you think Egypt can position itself? Because Egypt has also hedged its bets with the West and with its own Arab partners or, partners in the Middle East. What now going forward? Because we have a belligerence coming from Washington. We have conflict in the Middle East. We have countries absolutely divided on how to deal with radical, violent extremism. What are Egypt's answers?
Difficult questions. Nothing but difficult questions for me. Okay. All right. So here's one thing. I'm going to be completely undiplomatic here. Egypt has long abdicated its regional soft power and is more of a follower in terms of foreign policy than it is a leader. And that means that in something like, you mentioned the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The Israelis are completely unwilling to sort of, extend a hand. And it's quite unfortunate that other countries that are pro-peace are not sort of trying to think collectively on how we can...
Even when it came to the announcement of Jerusalem from Washington, for example, even on something like that, the Egyptians would sort of not want to rock the boat?
They wouldn't, and precisely because they sort of give up a lot of their sort of freedom of mind when it comes to foreign policy. So we're a little more, again, being super undiplomatic here. They're a lot more following Saudi Arabia or Washington, and a lot of people have a willingness to sort of not rock the boat increasingly in the region, even if it comes at the expense of human rights and of the rights of citizens that are being sort of trampled. And it's unfortunate that this is the path that Egypt has chosen. But if Egypt wants to sort of project its power a little bit more, I think we need to think a little more outside of these traditional alliances. Like not just, there's nothing wrong with having more friends, right? You're not going to lose your existing friends if you have more friends.
Right.
That's pretty basic. It's a pretty basic thing. And Egypt is, for instance, I think of Egypt as in context as an African country.
Yeah.
With very limited regional influence, which is sort of a mix of a poor historical baggage, but also of complete misunderstanding of Egypt vis-a-vis the rest of the continent, or particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and vice versa to a large extent, right? So I would, if I was redrawing that policy, I would actually start looking at not just trying to see how to make the leading countries happy, but also try to see how I can
serve your own interests as well.
I wasn't going to say that, but that follows from, if you're serving a larger community of smaller countries that you can build a stronger alliance with, I immensely believe that that countries are stronger together, and if you're your own rogue actor, if you're your own individual actor, I guess rogue is the wrong word. If you're your own individual actor, you are weaker than if you are sort of building alliances with a larger number of countries. So we should sort of be looking more into sort of south and west in the continent and sort of shore up this influence, and that essentially leads to serving our interests at the end of the day.
Right, Mohamed El Dashan, thanks very much
Thank you
for
very much.
talking to us. Thanks.
Thanks for your time.